is the reality of life. Now, the other countries, let's say the Italian community, the Chinese community, the Indian community, the Mexican community, those work as one country in relation to the United States.
Yeah.
Here, we often see Africa coming as a bloc. Is that not a hindrance to Africa, to foreign policy shifting towards Africa?
Yeah, it is. Bernard, I think you hit on a very, very important topic. I'm a Hungarian American. You know, I came here as a political refugee from Hungary. So I care a lot about Hungary, much more so than I care about all of Europe. You know, and especially now the African diaspora, they represent different countries. Ethiopian Americans care a great deal about what's happening in Ethiopia. African Americans, on the other hand, they don't have a direct pointer that goes back to Cameroon or Ghana or Benin or Togo or places like that. So in some respects, that is definitely a disadvantage because they can't focus their interests on particular places in Africa. However, we all know that there's some commonality as far as the entire continent is concerned. So at a minimum, if the African American community just was a huge force for really calling the US government to account for not giving enough attention to Africa, then that would do it because African Americans represent a huge block of votes. And as we know, in some states, it's 40, 50% of the population. So it's something that I feel that the community in the United States, the community of color should be taken advantage of.
Yeah, thank you. Can we say American politicians do not pay so much attention to Africa because Africa is not geostrategically or geopolitically important to American interests?
No, I believe that Africa is very, very important to American geostrategic interests. But here's the deal. You know, the United States is a superpower. It is. And the United States has interests in every place in the world. So there's 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. You can only give attention to X number of issues. You know, there's some people in your audience who think, the Americans can pay attention to every single issue in the world all the time. And that's true. No, it's not true. For example, when I was Assistant Secretary for Africa, we could focus on, say, 3 or 4 issues at a time. And Africa has 55 countries, however you want to call them, count them. And you can't focus on things that are not of the primary importance. And that's true for members of Congress. It's true for the White House. It's true for the National Security Council. So who gets focused on? Two sets of issues. One, the issues that matter most to America's security in the world. And two, the issues that are raised by voters who have a lot of influence with Washington. So those are the 2 sets of issues that get focused on. And unfortunately, as you and I both know, with Africa, it tends to be bad news. It's not, everybody's not focused on, they should be, that Africa is the youngest continent, population is going to double by 2050. It represents tremendous potential for economic growth. Africa is the richest continent with all of the minerals and commodities that Africa produces. No, that's not what people focus on. People focus on war in Ukraine, war in Gaza, as far as international relations go, immigration in the United States, inflation, China, things like that. So to get attention paid to Africa, you need to make political noise. And political noise means, pushing issues through the diaspora, but also very much pushing Africa through the African American community.
It boils now down to the communication media that we can have, right? Because if we don't have access to Fox, we don't have access to CNN, we don't have access to MSNBC and all the other media, how do you hear us? How do you hear us talk? Because we can talk amongst ourselves, we can attend council public halls, but at the end of the day, when there is no publicly generated noise for everybody to hear at the same time, the individual noise or issues raised at local levels tends to dissipate and disappear from the political spectrum.
Yeah, well, you know what, though? If you look and see how other groups have done it, say the Irish Americans or Italian Americans or even Hungarian Americans, you have affinity groups. You know, there's the Hungarian American Coalition, for example, and I know Italians have their, diaspora communities have their political action committees. And when you go into an office at Congress and you say, I represent 50,000 voters in your state or 5,000 voters in your congressional district, believe me, they immediately will pay attention and they will sit down with you and say, so what are the issues that are important to you?
So the message here is Africans should constitute themselves into affinity groups and into political action committees or groups to communicate with the politicians, and as such, their voices are going to be amplified if Africans actually want to generate that attention.
Absolutely. But the other important thing is, and we were talking about this before, is you can't come in with a 200-page manifesto. And unfortunately, some of the Africa diaspora groups love words. Love words, love long letters, love esoteric things that an American politician's eyes will glaze over. So the message has to be sharp, it has to be focused, and it can be, over, 200 different issues and places that no one's ever heard of. You have to be effective.
I can relate to that, and I know where you're coming from. I do, yeah. So, with that said, it's looking like okay. Let's put it this way: what is the role of the lobby firms in DC and New York? What is their role, and how do they influence government foreign policy?
Okay. From my point of view, again, this is my personal opinion. Lobby groups and firms are perfectly fine and they operate within the law. But I have found often that especially African embassies in Washington, they often get a lobbyist to do the work that they should be doing for themselves. Having been overseas at U.S. embassies, if we want to push a point of view, we do it ourselves. We make the appointment. We go see the members of the government. Whereas oftentimes in Washington, an African embassy will have a lobbyist go in and talk to members of Congress or people like that. But the lobbyists can be effective because they know how Washington works. They know who to go see. They know the members of the congressional staff. So yes, they do effective work, but they are not a necessity to getting your voice heard. Sometimes the organizations themselves are quite sophisticated and do it for themselves. Other times, they may be in Texas, and if they want to come to Washington, they may do it through a lobbyist. So organizations have to decide for themselves how best they can make their voices heard.
Thank you. And we get a comment here. Charles Nyikongi says, Africa would be delighted to have you back.
Well, that's great. I appreciate that from his lips to God's ears. We'll see.
That's amazing. And maybe he wants to ask you if you are actually advising any of the two campaigns at the moment.
I am engaged in one effort, which is kind of looking at the larger picture, but I don't want to talk about that right now.
That's understood. We can talk about that later. So let's get back to talk about the foreign policy and the Western the anti-Western influence. I know you've mentioned the American double standard policy towards the rest of the world and Africa, but China is actually growing. China's influence is actually growing exponentially on the continent. And you have affirmed this in one of your tweets recently, where you said, due to American foreign policy and history and neglect, China has become Africa's most trading and investment partner.
Mm-hmm.
Would you at any point look at American policy as a strategy to Americanize Africa, and that is what is bringing a lot of pushback also from the continent, while the Chinese and the Russians come in with their own form of diplomacy without necessarily forcing Africans to adopt certain Chinese or Russian policies or ways of life?
Yeah, you make an excellent point. And I know that I have said before that, America in Africa, America gives lectures and the Chinese make deals. And we just have to stop that, because we seem to have this one model that we call, this is what a democracy should look like, when in fact, from my personal point of view, legitimacy in the eyes of the people is the most important criteria that you have to apply to a government. I mean, again, coups are not a good thing, but if you have a elected leader who all of a sudden will change the Constitution over and over and over again, or have elections which are absolutely fraudulent, and then they are eventually overthrown by a military, and the people go out in the streets and cheer that military, I think it's a mistake for Western nations to automatically say, oh, that's a horrible thing that happened. We have to cut our relations with those people. We're going to punish them, put on sanctions and all kinds of things, instead of saying, listen, the previous government was not in any bit democratic. There was no other way around this. So let's work with the new military regime and see what we can do to help them evolve towards a kind of a system that the people of the country will be happy with. I think that that's very, very important, instead of having this one size fit all model. And then when something happens, the best we can do is to show up with a megaphone and yell at the people that what they're doing wrong, and you can't trade with the Chinese, you can't do this, you can't do that. That's guaranteed. That is guaranteed to ruin relations.
And we are seeing that the ruined relations in Africa over the last years, especially with the coup d'etat in the Sahel. Yeah. There have been too many threats. You need to stop. You need to get back to a democratic government, but nothing is changing. And the three countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, they have not reverted to a democratic form of government, and the threatened sanctions have not come forward. So,
Bernard, this is not a secret, I don't think, but I would bet you that the people in those countries are much more interested in peace and stability than elections at this moment.
I would agree with that. There is a comment here from Mungongo. I think that is something we could address. What is your take on the recent development between the U.S. and the new authorities in Niger? I remember that the latter requested the U.S. military to leave the country.
Yeah, I think to me that particular instance exemplifies what I was just saying is wrong with U.S. policy. I think that the U.S. government, unfortunately, took a megaphone to telling the regime in Niger what it was doing wrong, what it should do, what it cannot do. And at that point, the soldiers in charge in Niamey said, thank you very much, United States. You can go home now. And that if the objective to criticize the coup government, or is the objective to help stabilize Niger, get the people peace and security, and then work with the government that's in charge to evolve towards a democratic system that will be acceptable to the people?
Yeah, and let's put it this way. If you were still in charge, what should have you done practically? I know we are all geniuses in hindsight, but what should have you done practically to kind of reduce the tension?
Okay, let's set something straight, Bernard. The Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the United States does not make policy. The Assistant Secretary recommends policy to the bosses above, you know, the Deputy Secretary, the Secretary, the National Security Council at the White House, because at the end of the day, it's the president's policy, you know, through the Secretary of State. So, you know, I can say, from my point of view, from having been familiar with Africa since 1978, I suggest you do X, Y, and Z, and they can either take it or leave it. So then they tell me what they want done, and you know, my choices are either to implement what they want done or to say I'm out of here. So you know, so that is the problem. Now, my suggestion would have been that it's in the interest of the United States of America to promote peace and security in the Sahel. So if these are the people that we have to deal with, we have to deal with them. We have to see where we can agree, and we have to kind of influence them towards, once we can get some peace and security, to say, okay, we're going to leave, go back to the barracks, and here's how we're going to do it. But again, I go back to the point. From my point of view, the critical element in all of these things is legitimacy from the eyes of the people. If the government in place is legitimate in the people's eyes, then we should deal with them. If the people consider the government totally illegitimate, then it's going to be a losing proposition going forward.
But how do you know if the people have determined the government to be illegitimate or
well,
legitimate?
You know, Bernard, our embassies, we have embassies in every country except, you know, a couple, and our embassies have a very good sense of what's going on the ground. You know, I can take a taxi ride in any African city, and I'll find out in 10 minutes exactly what the people of that country think of their government, much more so than going in and sitting down with the foreign minister who's going to give me the party line.
Mr. Ambassador, are you saying that elections sometimes do not matter?
Elections absolutely matter. But what's critically important is the type of elections. Because if, you know, for example, you know, give me a break. The last elections in Zimbabwe, did they really matter? Did we have any doubt of the outcome? I mean, how about in President Biya's Cameroon?
We are watching 2025 to see what is going to happen. Are you by any chance saying the elections in Cameroon are not credible, Mr. Ambassador?
I'm not saying that they're not credible. I'm just saying that we know who's going to win ahead of time.
Because the opposition is weak.
There are several reasons, okay? One reason you might have is that the opposition is weak and the opposition is divided, or if the opposition is stupid enough to not participate in the elections. But then you have the other case where the system is so rigged and the opposition leaders are all in jail that you know who's going to win ahead of time. I mean, in these elections, you know that Kagame's in, Museveni's in, Mnangagwa is in, Biya is in. Give me a break. You know, you've seen my tweets. I say the international community should save money. Why send election observers? You know, I went into this in Ethiopia when I was ambassador because the Europeans, who I consider very naive at times, were talking about how many election observers they're going to send to the elections. And I said, you can send 1 million election observers. They can stand shoulder to shoulder. But if the government in place is unwilling to have itself voted out of power, then we already know what the outcome of the election is going to be.
Does that not, in a sense, say that Western powers actually influence and decide who is going to be the president of most African countries?
No, not at all. Not anymore. Once upon a time, I would say that you were probably right. But right now, I'll tell you who influences the outcome of elections in most African countries is the regime in place. You know, if President Museveni absolutely will not allow himself to be voted out, he's not going to be voted out. But then look at the recent South African elections. You know, I criticize South Africa all the time because of their foreign policy. But you have to look honestly at their internal politics. And, you know, the ANC took a beating. They admitted that they took a beating. And they went ahead and very, I think, wisely decided to form a unity government with people who philosophically they absolutely disagree with. So to me, that is quite a courageous step, as opposed to, yeah, let's get back to Zimbabwe. Did anybody think that Mnangagwa was going to be defeated? You know, give me a break.
So do you think Paul Biya is going to be defeated in Cameroon in 2025?
It depends. How old is he?
Does age actually matter here?
It does. We all have a shelf life.
But it's elections, and the person who is voted more wins the votes, and that's the president.
Yeah, the question is, who counts the votes?
Is that something that can happen in the United States also? Because 2016 highly questioned, 2020 highly questioned, and 2024 lots of tension in the atmosphere.
Yeah, there's lots of tension, but I'll be honest with you. In the United States, what I really like is with the United States federal system, elections are, even the national elections, really are conducted at the local level. And if the people who work in the polls are members of the community, you actually, you may know who they are. A lot of the times they're volunteers who are retired people who have done this over and over again. So there's a verification, system to look at the votes. So personally, I have absolutely no problems with how the 2020 elections turned out. But I know that a lot of people do. Even there are members of my own family who disagree with me, but myself, you had the presidential election come out in one direction, but at the same time, the Senate, people running for Senate and Congress in those same places were from the other party.
Absolutely.
So that, I mean, you know as well as I do. I mean, and where you're living, everybody tends to vote for Democrats, at least on the western part of the state. In the eastern part of the state, people vote for Republicans. Yeah. Where I'm living here in Arlington, Virginia, Republicans don't even need to run for office because they're not going to be elected. But my Texas home in West Texas, oftentimes there's not even Democrats on the ballot. So, it depends.
That is the paradox with elections. Sometimes the outcome is fixed, and sometimes it is a competition that could be as brutal as it can